Hello and welcome to the headline keynote session on day 2 of the Info Security Magazine Autumn Online Summit 2023. My name is James Coker, Deputy Editor Info Security Magazine, and I'll be your moderator for this session, which is entitled CISO's Guide to Cyber Risk Management in an Ever-Evolving Landscape. Before I introduce you to our presenters, I'll just run through a few bits of housekeeping. You can submit any questions you have for our presenters using the Submit a Question button, and we'll do our best to answer it before the end of the webinar. In terms of CPE credits, all of our sessions qualify our viewers for CPE and CPD credits based on the minimum attendance time. Please view the document in the Resources tab on your screen for all information about CPE credits. And finally, do head to our sponsor section, which can be found also in our Resources tab to take a look at those who are supporting this event. Now, I'm delighted to be joined by two excellent speakers for this session. I'm really looking forward to this presentation. So we have Andy Smeaton, who is CISO at Affinity, and we have his colleague, Jeremy Ross, who is Information Security Officer at Affinity. So without further ado, I'm going to hand straight over to Jeremy and Andy. Over to you guys.
Thanks, guys.
Great, thank you. Now, my name is Jeremy Ross. I'm an Information Security Officer at Affinity, as James told us. And I'd like to say this is from a CISO's perspective, but I am not a CISO yet, but Andy is a 6-time CISO, so I think we are covered there. Now, a little bit of housekeeping before we start. I want to talk about what we're going to cover. So we're covering today the basics of security programs, security frameworks. Then we're going to dive into the Written Information Security Program, a little bit about regulations, and then we're going to wrap up with budgeting and how to really find out what you need as a CISO to provide balance to the security program. Before we go any further, though, I want to talk about this analogy that I've heard for information security. And the analogy is security is like the brakes on a car. If you know anything about cars, brakes actually enable the car to go faster. Similarly, information security is like the brakes because we can enable the business to operate better and safer. And so with that, I want to pass it to Andy. So Andy can tell you at the end of the presentation what we're going to do and some tools you can take home.
Okay, I want to dig into some real world examples today that have helped me and companies historically, how data-driven risk can help security leaders, how risk-driven budget discussions can help security leaders and executive leadership really understand. The other thing I want to do is I want people to walk away with some real world examples here. So at the end, I'm going to give you my connection to LinkedIn, and I'm happy to share some of the templates that I've used for budgets, for presenting budgets and stuff, right? For presenting budgets, for how you present risk to boards and how you present budgets to boards too.
Great. Now, jumping into the standards, frameworks, and certifications piece, one question I always like to ask information security professionals is who actually has read and understands their WISP at their organization? And if not, if you haven't done it, you really might want to, because the WISP provides those guidelines to the organization to ensure that there's standards and formalization around all your documented rules and designs, the processes by which you actually operate on a day-to-day basis. So if you understand your WISP, you can really help your whole team eliminate that confusion and inconsistency. The tagline here is you don't want to do business without knowing how you're doing business. And the WISP will really help you describe and understand that. Now, when you talk about the WISP, there's two pieces that you need to actually make sure you have: the exception management process and the risk acceptance process. Those two processes in themselves are going to be critical to making sure the WISP is actually understood. Now, the other piece here is the information security frameworks. You can't just go select one at random by throwing darts on a wall. You have to actually select one that is tailored to your organization's requirements and needs. And the frameworks here, they provide a checklist for the design of your security program. That's all. It ensures controls and processes are not ignored, and they help define everyone's roles. Additionally, it can also help support the maintenance and revision as the program continues to mature. So overall, you want to remember, don't do business without knowing how you're doing business. And then with frameworks, don't be successful on accident. Select a framework that's tailored for you.
Yeah. And Jeremy, I want to reiterate the importance of having a formalized risk assessment process and creating risk transparency in the organization. And I'll go back to a story. It was 10 o'clock one night, and a friend of mine, a CISO friend of mine, they'd suffered a breach. And he called me up. It was like 10 p.m. We were texting back and forth all day. And he'd had a lot of conversations with other business leaders in the organization. All of a sudden, he was on his own. And he said to me, he said, Andy, I've never felt so alone in my life. All these joint decisions that we made, he was now on his own and he was left kind of holding the bag. But budget decisions that were made for him, right, weren't documented. Things that he'd asked for were not documented subsequently and stuff, right? He was in a really bad position. So a lot of times you really need to have a formalized risk assessment process to protect yourself as a security professional.
That's interesting. Andy, can we also touch a bit about on the framework piece about framework fatigue? Because I've seen that as well, where, if you don't select that tailored framework, you're going to end up with so many frameworks selected that your team is going to spend more time maintaining than actually, achieving those.
So typically in the last few organizations, Jeremy, I've used the NIST CSF, right? The NIST cybersecurity framework. And transparency, again, risk transparency. So when I walk into an organization in the first 90 days, I'll do a NIST cybersecurity framework assessment, and I'll share that assessment with the organization from the ELT, with my security team. Typically, too, what I'll do, I'll ask the team to do their own assessment, and I'll go back to an example. And so I advise 4 companies, and I'm a CISO for one. And one of the companies I walked into, I said, hey, please perform a CSF, cybersecurity risk assessment. And they did, and they come back, and the team said to me, it was like 4 or 5 directors, and they said to me, Andy, we think we're a 4, but we should have been a 5, right? Now, anyone knows the NIST CSF, you'll never get there, right? You'll never get to a 4 or a 5. 5 is like the NSA. And so that told me a lot of things. One, they really didn't understand the program. They didn't understand the NIST CSF, right? When I did that same CSF, we were actually below a 2. And I explained this to the team of like efficacy, the reasons why we were below a 2 and stuff, right? But it's important, to your point, Jeremy, it's important that you pick a framework and then you stick with that framework, but be very transparent. On that, when you're building a framework and stuff, like in the CSF, for example, you can utilize budget spent and look at the ROI. So the ROI. So if you're going to a CFO, you can say, okay, hey, the return on investments is going to take us to here on an CSF, for example.
Now, jumping forward to regulations and risk, regulations, unlike frameworks, are one of the areas where adherence is mandatory. You could select a framework, but regulations you cannot select. They can have negative impacts on your program overall, and generally on the business, placing different requirements on them that can really not do much to mitigate risks. So this is a key area where risk acceptance by leadership, your leadership, your bosses, et cetera, is critical because deviations can have tremendous financial impact, potential reputational impact, fines, et cetera. This is also a potential area where you can be blocked from doing business in certain locations, such as what happened with NYDFS. We'll talk a little bit more about this when we discuss risk-aware decision-making, but again, this is a very critical area where you have to understand this adherence is mandatory. On that front, it's actually an interesting story. Andy's told me about when PCI DSS came up at a previous organization, the leadership wasn't aware. They weren't aware why they were complying to it. I don't know if you want to talk to that a little bit, Andy.
Yeah, it was, I walked into an organization and the CEO had asked me, he said, like, why are we doing this? We've done it for 4 years. And actually, when we dug in, there was no actual need for us. We didn't process any credit card data and stuff. There was no requirements whatsoever, for us to do that. And that's part of like walking into an organization and really understanding the assessment. And I'll talk about that a little bit later.
Great. And yeah, that's again, going back to understanding, hey, what does the business need to do to actually operate and operate effectively? That's the whole cyber risk and business requirements balance. And fast forwarding a little bit, Andy, can you tell me a little bit about how can I trust, the NIST CSF benchmark results if I'm doing that when I'm, measuring cyber risk and business in general?
Well, I think that comes with experience, right, Jeremy? So the more experienced you are, and asking for a second opinion, if other team members, you might have directors, other team members, ask them to do it independently, and then sort of bring that together. You can also, and I've done this in the past. I was in one organization, and I assessed ourselves at a 3.11. And then we brought in PwC, and $50,000 or $80,000, sorry, later, they assessed us at a 3.12, which was, kind of a waste of money. But with experience, you can really become accurate. It's very important that you're really honest with yourselves, and it's very important that you look at the efficacy of tools, which I'll talk about. We'll circle back on that in a while. Let's talk about vulnerability management here, Jeremy. And I go back to a story in vulnerability management. There's the presentation again. So I go back to a story in vulnerability management. I walked into an organization, and the CEO came into my office, and he said, how's your first day? How are you settling in? And then he threw a 400 page report on my desk, and he said, Andy, what is this? And so I quickly looked through it, and I said, it's a vulnerability management report. And he said, I know that, but what is it? He said, this is Klingon to me. It could be in Chinese. I just don't understand it. And what was happening, the previous CISO was supplying these vulnerability management reports every month. And I want to talk about this later, about metrics and stuff, right? It's really important that you give the correct metrics, and you can translate that vulnerability management report into real risk scores. What we did in that particular company is we looked at the 6 business lines, and we were using a product there. We were using actually Qualys as a product, and a different product on top of that to convert it into risk scores. And I started to give real risk scores for the business lines, and it was basically a score out of 1,000. And 0 to 300, that was green. 300 to 700, that was orange. 700 to 1,000, that was red. And we started having really good conversations on the board and around the ELT. And the conversations, hey, why is this particular business line, why is that an orange, Andy? And then I'd dig in and say, well, it might be a lack of investment, or it might be a prioritization issue and stuff, right? But we got to the real conversations and stuff, not just a vulnerability management report. Jeremy?
Yeah, and on this slide, one of the things I want to highlight here is that there are alternatives to just generally displaying vulnerabilities as we know them by severity, and that is the common place that we have now. Is you use the CVSS scoring system, and the rates are based on their severity, critical, high, medium, low, etc. But being data-driven information security professionals, we want to do our best to add other elements to that so the information is more actionable, we can prioritize better. And so we have 2 other alternatives here. There are a few other alternatives here that we'd like to present. One of them is the vulnerability exploitability scoring system. And this considers the probability of the vulnerability actually being exploited in the wild, which again adds a little bit more data. So then you can decide, how am I going to prioritize my resources to remediate in the best way possible? Other strategies include location-based prioritization and asset-based prioritization. There are other ways, but we're just presenting this to you again to have the approach of what other data pieces can I use to make it more data-driven, or what is a common process here.
And you can take that a step further. One of the organizations I walked into, we took the vulnerability management score. It was pretty mature, and we looked at the IDR, so the SIEM, so we could see really the likelihood of occurrence of something happen. And then we put in a control. So what controls? We rated the controls and stuff like a 1 to 5, and it gave us real risk scores and stuff, right? Not perfect, but good enough and stuff, right? Good enough for the LT, executive leadership team, or the SLT, or the board to understand. Jeremy, you want to talk about the depth of the advanced attacker?
I would love to, Andy. I think one thing that a lot of people, information security professionals alike, get caught up with is the idea that these attackers are much more advanced than we think, and that we need all these special multi-million-dollar tools to combat them. Now, I'm not saying we don't. However, there are extremely advanced adversaries out there, but the vast majority of attacks take advantage of the basic security gaps, the basic gaps in hygiene, weak passwords, missing multi-factor authentication, unsecured remote access. Social engineering is classic, unpatched systems. So it's really the basic cyber hygiene that we should focus on first here. Not saying don't ignore all the marketing hype, don't ignore, what new tools are emerging, etc. However, really focus on, what is your core critical components of your security program. That is what's most likely to mitigate those attacks. So your chosen framework, your regulations, mitigating key risks. So your organization has a strong foundation to build upon, not the next shiny thing or marketing buzzword that's going to be welcome to the market. So I think we as information security professionals have to kind of combat this with a sense of realism and reasonable action.
Jeremy, quite often as a CISO, I've walked into organizations or advised organizations and, walking in and doing assessments. And I'll give you one example. There was an example of a company, over 80 tools, 80 different security tools. And the team was just about 40 people. And it was a crazy abundance of tools. What I look at like try to consolidate the tool sets and stuff, for one tool to do multiple functions. And most importantly, look at the efficacy of tools. When I was digging in to the 80 tools, some of the tools were efficacy was 40%, 50%, right? So the efficacy of tools is so important, right? And I love it. Get back to basics as a security professional. Jeremy, you want to talk about this?
Yes. So risk-aware decision-making, what is it really? We as InfoSec professionals need to focus on accepting the right level of risk and communicating it properly to support business requirements. And one of the first questions I asked Andy was, Andy, how do we determine acceptable, risk level? Isn't that going to be different? And the truth is it does depend. But what you have to do as a professional is really make sure you go to the business, understand your regulatory compliance needs, understand what it means, for the business to have success generating revenue. Is that in new product lines, existing product lines? Because you have to understand where are you at and what are you securing. So when you start going down this process, understand your compliance areas, understand the business, where your organizational risks, then you'll be able to make those informed decisions, guide your resource allocations, identify threats, and then actually make sure that your stakeholders are focusing and communicating and resolving those threats. If Andy, could you speak about that contractual risk story? You had one about a telecom industry, I think is pretty interesting.
Yes, yeah. Well, let me talk about that a little bit later on metrics and stuff. But what I want to say is something that's really important. Keep it simple, right? So know your audience of who you're speaking to. And I've spoke to all sorts, and I go back to a mistake I made years ago. I was working for a bank called Danvers Bank that's now been acquired, and I gave a presentation. And I gave the presentation to the board members. And at the end of the presentation, we're having a couple of glasses of wine in a restaurant, and the board member said to me, he said, "Andy," he said, that was really good. He said, "But I didn't understand what you were saying." And then I looked up his background. And his background, it was actually in a jacuzzi hot tubs, right? And, he'd owned his own company and stuff, right? Had a very successful company. He ended up on a board of the bank. So kind of know that. But risk-aware decision-making, get back to that, it is data-driven, right? Make sure you stand on data. Make sure you present the facts. As a security leader, I don't talk about opinions. I talk about the data, always the data, and talk about the risk of the data and convey that and be very transparent of the risk. Be very transparent of your risk and be very transparent of data, and that will establish credibility. And then next slide, Jeremy, again, it's just more to do with risk-aware decision-making, but we can sort of move on from that. Unless, do you want to add anything?
I just want to add one piece there, which is on that slide. One of the best ways to actually analyze all those factors and the factors mentioned here is just using a risk register. So, it's a good tool to use when you're documenting risk across the org, various factors for consideration. I would consider it foundational, similar to a WISP. It encourages accountability and it's centralized. So please keep that in mind.
Yeah, it's a very good point, Jeremy. Very good point. So let's talk about metrics, do's and don'ts. And to the point before, every organization of risk-aware decision-making and stuff, right? You be very transparent and you present the metrics. And I always talk about, what's the metrics that matter? Quite often walking into organizations and stuff, I see a ton of metrics that's given to the ELT, the executive leadership team, or given to the board, and they don't mean anything. One organization I walked into, we were getting all sorts of like technical metrics. And I kind of looked at the report, and after the assessment, we weren't making our contractual obligations for the company. And so I started talking about like, here's the contractual obligations, here's the metrics of, we have X amount of customers, and here's the customers that we're not meeting our contractual obligations to, right? That was so much more important, because the ELT then seen me as, hey, Andy's trying to protect the revenue. It's not the CISO that's coming in asking for money. He's trying to protect this multi-million-dollar stream of revenue. Which is good, and it creates positive relationships like that, right? So again, I'm hitting on the same points over and over again, but be very transparent and be data driven to present that information.
And the word here, Andy, for metrics that you remind me of is actionable. Metrics cannot be valuable if there's no context.
Yeah, very actionable, and just time to the business and time to revenue in some way whatsoever and stuff, right? This is my approach to budgeting, and I want to kind of share a story here. Years ago, as a CISO, I would go to the CFO and I'd do my presentation of like what we need, and maybe say I was asking for $40 million, right? And this, I'd have the conversation and present all the security reasons why we need to be secure as an organization. What was happening is, I'd ask for 40 million. The CFO would hit me back and say, okay, we can give you 25 million. I'll be 35 million, and he'd be 27 million. And it was literally like bartering for a handbag in Turkey or something. What I do now is a total different approach. I talk about risk, and I go in and I talk about, hey, here's our obligations to run the business, right? Here's what it's going to take to run a business. Here's our gap one, and here's our gap two, and I'll talk about growth too. So gap one, gap two, gap three, and I make the CFO and the ELT a part of that decision, right? It's not my decision to make. I make them part of that decision. So they come back to me, and what I've found, and I've been doing this now for a number of years, I'm a lot more successful in gaining the budget that I need. Quite often, because CFOs are very risk adverse, quite often they'll say, okay, we want to close gap one and gap two. And I'm like, thanks very much. That's 37 million, right? Gap three, if you want to close, that's another 3 million. But I'll get most of the stuff. Or I have the CFO sign off on a decision. I'll go back a slide, Jeremy, just for you. Anything to add there?
No, not too much, really. I mean, both slides are extremely valuable. And I think the biggest key takeaway here is, rather than categorizing by expense type alone, from the strategic budgeting perspective, when you translate it into, categories that reflect operational scenarios of the business, is the business growing? Are there gaps in the business information security program? And, what is really core? Running the business, your baseline. When you translate your expense types to that lens, then it's an a la carte menu, really. And then, as Andy says, you put it back on the CFO, which is incredibly transformative and much more helpful.
Thanks, Jeremy. So I've been to a lot of presentations, and you walk out of presentations and you really think, okay, that was good, but I don't really understand it. So let me help you. What I want to offer, if you want to connect to me, Andrew Smeaton, via LinkedIn, just send me a message, said, hey, you're on a presentation. I can send you the PowerPoint of how I present a budget, and I'll send you some, basic risk tools that will help you, communicate the right way to make risk-aware decision making. Thank you very much. And questions, guys?
Thank you so much, Andy and Jeremy. Really informative presentation, and brilliant practical advice there, I think, for security leaders and security professionals to take away into their jobs. So really appreciate that. We've got a few minutes left for questions, as you mentioned. So I thought I'd fire off a couple I've got in my head. So one thing I wanted to ask you about is you clearly hear a lot of in terms of cyber risk management, the need to engage with the board and C-suite effectively. What would be your advice for security leaders to be able to do this effectively and communicate, in the right language and right way?
Great question. First of all, really know your board. I mean, I've been with I've had board members that have been super technical and can really understand technical jargon. So know your board. And then I've had the guy, the jacuzzi guy, right? The owner of a jacuzzi company, right? So know who you're speaking to and translate to that particular person. Secondly, establish credibility. Don't talk about opinions. You know, as a security leader, don't go in about opinions. I've done this so many times and had opposite opinions to CIOs and stuff, right? And then I come up with the data. So I'll have, I establish credibility by using data. And quite often that's very successful because you establish credibility within the board.
Brilliant. And yeah, I suppose that data feeds into that language of business as well, which is so important. Yeah. Another question I had is, obviously we're at a time where of a bit of economic turmoil and a lot of organizations and security teams are seeing their budgets squeezed. So I was wondering if you had some practical tips for security leaders to manage cyber risk effectively whilst their budgets are being squeezed potentially.
Yeah, that's great. So make your budgets around outcomes, right? Outcome driven metrics, right? Outcome. So show the ROI, and then you're not the person that makes that decision. You present it, and you can present you can present your opinion, right? But make the CFO a part of that and document that, because quite often when I go back to my handbag story and stuff, right? Quite often I was unsuccessful early on in the career is the way I went about it. I went about it from a security perspective. Now I talk about it from a business perspective, and I really put the risk decision back on the CFO. CFO, again, are super risk averse, right? So you tend to get a lot more if you can tie it back to the business and tie it back to business outcomes.
Yeah, if I can add a little bit there, the last thing you want in a previous life, I had a mentor tell me, we're going into the budgeting meeting, and he said, "Don't smile. This is like fighting Mike Tyson." And and that's what it is. It can be that if you're going expense type for expense type against a CFO. So when you do, that's why we say, transform it into what are the outcomes for the business? What do I need to run it? Where are the gaps? And where's the business growth going? Because if you do that, then it's much less of a fight and you're having a conversation around risk and positive outcomes for the business.
That's it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, guys.
Just to say one thing, Jeremy, that wasn't me, right?
That was not Andy.
Good. All right, thank you.
That's good to know. Good to know. No worries. And perhaps just a final question. I was wondering if I could get both of your perspectives on what you see as the key future trends and development that will have the biggest impact on cyber risk, perhaps in the coming years, and how do you think this will impact how security leaders need to approach the area of risk management?
Well, not to use a buzzword, right, but AI. And I wrote a few papers on this like 3 or 4 years ago on LinkedIn about like AI for good, AI for bad. That's good. That's going to be sort of massive. But what we're seeing now of maturity of security programs will really tie in well into the business, into business outcomes. And you're going to see more of that, which is super important, right? Really tie your security program into business outcomes and stuff, right? Change the narrative from a negative to a positive to, hey, this is the guy that's coming into the boardroom and protecting our revenue. This is a revenue protection investment. Jeremy?
No, Andy, I think you nailed it. I definitely stay away from all the buzzwords of everything, but I think AI is transformational already. And so I think that's going to be something we have to focus on there. But Andy, I think you nailed it.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, guys. And just on that point, our next session is going to be on the topic of AI versus AI, unleashing the future of cyber defense, which will be starting in around 15 minutes time. But I'm afraid that's all we've got time for our keynote session on day 2. And a huge thank you to Andy and Jeremy for your time and for those insights. It was really appreciated. It's really valuable for our audience, I think. As I mentioned, the next session, AI versus AI, Unleashing the Future of Cyber Defense, which is a panel discussion, will be starting at 11:30 Eastern Time or 4:30 GMT. But thank you for tuning in, and this session is now ending. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.